Good afternoon, everybody. It seems to me that this is a phenomenal panel, but I think I'll leave that for the end. So my name is Nestor Medina, and we are looking forward to this panel on post-secular Canada and decolonization. The presenters of today will be in the order in which they are listed in the program. And what I'm going to do is just introduce them, and then they're going to present, and then we have a brief Q&A, and then we'll proceed to the second paper. If we have a little bit of time closer to the end, I might just open it to a general conversation, but we'll see it when it comes. All right, so our first presenter is David Seljak, who is very well known for many of you and me, who is Professor of Religious Studies at St. Jerome University in Waterloo, Ontario, and Chair of the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Waterloo. With Paul Bramadat, he co-edited Religion and Ethnicity in Canada in 2005 and Christianity and Ethnicity in Canada in 2008. He's part of the editorial team working on Indigenous Spiritualities in Canada, the third volume of that series. And he has authored research reports for the Canadian government's Department of Canadian Heritage on Religion and Multiculturalism in Canada, and consulted also with the Ontario Human Rights Commission on its policy on freedom of religion. From 2005 to 2018, he has also served as the editor of The Ecumenist, a journal of theology, culture, and society, which is very well known to many, published by Novalis. His presentation of today, as is already in the program, but I'll repeat it nevertheless, is Indigenous Spirituality and Healthcare in a Post-Secular Canada. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nestor, for that generous introduction. I'd like to start by acknowledging that St. Jerome's University and the University of Waterloo are located on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. We are situated, in fact, on the Haldimand Tract, the land granted to 6 nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. And I thank Nestor for including those references in his introduction, because this is part of a chapter that Paul and I have written for the 3rd volume of our series on religion in Canada, and which is being co-edited with Heidi Stark and John Burrows, both at the University of Victoria. The crisis in health outcomes for Indigenous people has inspired an amazing variety of innovations in the healthcare sectors, including integrating Indigenous culture and spirituality in treatment, challenging racism, both overt and systemic, and transferring control and ownership of healthcare delivery to Indigenous communities themselves. Paul and I argue that many of these innovations integrate Indigenous spirituality into healthcare delivery for Indigenous people. And doing so, these innovations challenge both the guardian-ward relationship that marked healthcare provision in the past, as well as the boundaries established by mainline Canadian secularism. In fact, they push the Canadian state and society to a post-secular future. So a post-secular future depends on an understanding of what our secular present is, and we call this the secular Canada story. The secular narrative emerged as a solution to a problem, and that problem was the deep roots of Christian privilege in Canada. The shift now is, the shift of what we might think of as Christian Canada to the secular Canada story occurred between the 1960s and the 1990s, and is one of the key facts of Canadian life over the last 50 years. In fact, the new public culture that emerged in the 1960s, we argue, was comprised of 3 interlocking features. The first, the ideology of secularism, that movement from a Christian society or religious society to a secular one was a moral advance. The introduction of human rights codes and discourses, and thirdly, the ideology of multiculturalism, that ethnic diversity in our society was not simply a demographic fact, but actually a good to be pursued. And we would argue that these changes led to a double separation. First is the more obvious and more explicit separation of church and state. The other is the separation of the nation, or ethne, and the state. Canada became less of a kind of ethnic nation state. No longer do people say this is a British country or its French equivalent in Quebec. Both separations were supported by an emerging commitment to human rights, which promoted the equality and equal moral worth of all people. As is often the case in Quebec, the situation was somewhat different. Neither of these two separations of church or state, or of nation and state, were of course entirely successful. And so we say that the secular narrative was layered on top of an existing normatively European Christian settler society. Now, in our earlier work, Paul and I have outlined how the new religious pluralism in Canada, created by the liberalization of immigration laws in the 1960s, has challenged this secular story and moved us towards a post-secular society. Now, what exactly a post-secular society is, we're not sure, because post-secularism is not a single movement. It's a name that's used to capture a kind of decentralized, multifaceted, and often spontaneous critique of the current secular arrangement from a variety of communities and stakeholders. However, it must be noted that this shift from Christian Canada to the secular Canada story, although a moral advance, was not animated by any effort to improve the lives of Indigenous people. It's fair to say that these communities were largely not on the agenda that included promoting human rights, multiculturalism, and secularism as solutions to the problem presented by Christian Canada. For example, while the mainline discourse on multiculturalism had virtually nothing to say about the continued existence of residential schools, the sorry state of healthcare for Indigenous people, and other injustices and indignities. It also had little to say about the efforts of Indigenous people to advance their own political, cultural, spiritual, and religious objectives. With some embarrassment, Paul and I confess that for much of our lives, academic and personal, we shared in this collective and self-serving ignorance. Concerns about indigenization and decolonization emerged only later, largely driven by the efforts of Indigenous people to address long-standing injustices and problems. What these concerns have demonstrated to us is that the secular Canada model failed Indigenous peoples, especially with respect to the mishandling of the spiritual and cultural practices and perspectives related to health. However, what we're seeing now is interesting. The conventional health system continues to move in the direction of positivistic and evidence-based medicine. And precisely at the same time, it is moving in the opposite direction, as hospitals and other healthcare providers are asked, and generally agree, to attend more respectfully to the religious and spiritual need of Indigenous people. These developments are closing down old relations of the guardian and ward nature that marked mainline attitudes towards healthcare delivery to Indigenous people, at the same time that they open up new and still evolving relations of partnership, reciprocity, cultural humility, and respect. So basically what we're arguing is that in the face of clear inequalities and inequities in health outcomes between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians, the Canadian state and other public institutions have opened themselves up to this discourse of spirituality in order to promote the reduction of Indigenous-specific racism in mainline healthcare delivery. So we started our chapter with the bad news, and there's plenty of bad news when it comes to the healthcare outcomes of Indigenous peoples. Indigenous people in Canada, as in other settler societies, experienced dramatically poorer health outcomes compared to the dominant non-Indigenous populations. It is important to remember that the inequalities and inequities in healthcare outcomes and the circumstances that help to bring them about vary from community to community, just as they do from individual to individual. It is also important to note that Indigenous women often face different outcomes and different barriers to healthcare. That being said, the situation overall is grim. At birth, for example, the life expectancy of Indigenous people is, depending on the community, about 12 to 7 years lower than the Canadian average. In terms of mental health, suicide rates in Indigenous communities are 6.5 to 2.7 times higher than in non-Indigenous communities. Indigenous people also score lower on measures of self-rated mental health and higher on mental health illness hospitalization than non-Indigenous Canadians. In fact, Indigenous people fare worse than non-Indigenous Canadians in terms of disability, oral health, and a host of other serious conditions, including arthritis, asthma, diabetes, disability, obesity, and tuberculosis. According to Health Canada, it is essential to understand the health outcomes for Indigenous people in the context of the, quote, transgenerational effects of colonization on the environmental, psychosocial, and health conditions of communities, unquote. Charlotte Reading and Fred Wien identify colonization, racism, and exclusion as the most important determinants of the poor health outcomes of Indigenous peoples. For example, they cite the disruption of Indigenous lifeways by the reserve systems, residential schools, and other restrictions on mobility to explain why many Indigenous communities are located so far away from quality healthcare, struggle with food insecurity and unsafe drinking water, or face higher rates of poverty and unemployment. Ironically, many of these poor health outcomes can be traced to the very institutions and structures that are meant to serve Indigenous people. For example, many Indigenous people report that they face stigmatization and racism in healthcare institutions. Regrettably, these findings have been confirmed in a variety of healthcare contexts. Beyond overt experiences of racism, many Indigenous people report finding these institutions, defined as they are by Western biomedicine, foreign or even threatening because they do not reflect their culture or understandings of health. In some, Canada's dominant healthcare system may unintentionally exacerbate the poor healthcare outcomes they were meant to address. The fact that they were not, they are not, for the most part, created or governed for and by Indigenous people means that Indigenous people are not adequately represented among healthcare workers, leaders, or decision makers, that Indigenous people may face racism and discrimination in healthcare delivery, that the culture and practices of these institutions may ignore or even suppress Indigenous health-related knowledge, culture, and practices, that these institutions promote a Western biomedical model that may create barriers to cultural sensitivity and safety in the practice of healthcare, and that these institutions often exclude Indigenous people from yet another realm of self-determination, which itself, Michael Marmot, the British sociologist, has noted, can itself lead to poor health outcomes. So that's the bad news. On the good news, we have some significant change, and we call this section the promise. Well aware that these are evolving and not achieved goals. For our purposes, it is significant that one sees an integration of Indigenous health and healing practices, especially those connected to Indigenous spirituality, into the Canadian healthcare system itself. Here there is some good news. For example, Alberta Health Services has adopted measures to enhance cultural competency and safety training, respect Indigenous tradition and protocols, establish meaningful relationship with Indigenous partners, and deliver Indigenous health and healing programs. Ceremonial spaces and sweat lodges have been introduced in various institutions under its authority. Here we see initiatives that begin to challenge the marginalization of spirituality and some would argue religion in public institutions. In the field of mental health, especially addictions counseling, we find even more openness to Indigenous spirituality. For example, in the Nimki Nupi Gawagan Healing Center in Muncie, Ontario, it has adopted a culture-based model of recovery from solvents addiction that promotes holistic, that is, physical, mental, social, and spiritual health. Funded by Health Canada, NIMCI attempts to integrate Indigenous healing and Western psychiatry. A 2014 scoping study of literature on the integration of Indigenous healing practices in addiction treatment across Canada found 17 types of cultural interventions, with sweat lodges being the most widely used. The authors found benefits in all areas of health and wellness, as well as a reduction in substance abuse. Consider as well Indigenous-led health partnerships, where Western biomedicine is integrated into agencies rooted in Indigenous culture and community. One such example is the Indigenous-led No Juanmanteg Health Centre on Manitoulin Island in Ontario, that offers a broad range of community services and programs to a number of First Nations for both physical and mental health through both traditional and Western healing methods. Along with access to physicians, specialists, nurses, and other healthcare workers, the Centre provides First Nation people with a traditional healer and firekeeper who passes on traditional teachings, performs healing ceremonies, and animates healing talking circles. The traditional healer and firekeeper may also provide counseling and cultural teaching. As a result of the promotion of this unique blended culture of healing and community connection, the Centre has recorded faster and better coordinated response times in urgent care and crisis, as well as greater reports of positive experience among clients and providers. Much is happening on the national level as well. For example, a report by Healthcare Can, the National Association of Healthcare Organizations and Hospitals, recommends developing ways to enhance Indigenous patient journey with a focus on mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical health. Innovations could include, quote, cultural helpers for spiritual and cultural supports, unquote, as well as ceremony rooms and outdoor tents to provide, quote, important sacred spaces, unquote. These examples illustrate a paradigm shift in the relationship between Indigenous people and Canada's public health institutions. On one hand, we see a move towards closing down certain guardian-ward relationship between the Canadian state and public institutions and Indigenous peoples. On the other hand, this closure is accompanied by an openness in many parts of the healthcare system to modes of healing and ways of relating that are deeply rooted in Indigenous spiritual life. What is remarkable in the various critiques of the dominant approach to healthcare for Indigenous people is how frequently and naturally Indigenous spirituality is invoked. Claims connecting health to spiritual practices, traditions, habits, and convictions are part of a broader effort in which Indigenous people seek an equal partnership in which they, as a people, can rely on their own set of knowledges, practices, and lifeways, and present them as equal in dignity, and sometimes even in effectiveness measured by Western standards, as those of the settler population. To analyze illness as being caused by spiritual malaise, to imagine intergenerational trauma as resulting in, quote, soul wounds, unquote, to criticize Western biomedicine for its mind-body dualism and its indifference to spiritual well-being, to propose integrating spirituality and spiritual care into a partnership with Western biomedicine, beyond simple chaplaincy services, that is, as a source of health and healing, or to insist that researchers take the spirituality of their subject seriously, is to introduce what many might call religious, or at least spiritual, categories into one of the most secular realms of modern public life. In any case, these innovations blur and sometimes obliterate the boundaries created by the secular liberal social order around the public and the private, the secular and the religious. Yet we see precisely these radical ideas proposed in study after study, and even more remarkably, being taken up by officially secular Canadian governments and public agencies. In fact, the ease with which the word spirituality is inserted almost automatically and without definition or commentary into these arguments about Indigenous healthcare is itself an important sign that stakeholders, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, are willing to rethink the borders of Canadian secularism. And with that, I'll shut up.
Wow, thank you so much, David. I was ready to send you a 2-minute notice, so you're way before. So that's excellent. Thank you so much. All right, let's open it up to to David. There's a whole lot there, and I have lots of questions, but that's pretty selfish. So let's open it up. If you could use the the feature of raise your hand, so that you can go up in the queue, and that will be much appreciated. Paige, please.
Hi, David. Thanks for that. I'm wondering, what is happening even prior to making referrals to Indigenous-centered programs. What is being done, if anything, to just address attitudes, right? So if people with addictions are still being pathologized, then how effective are the resources? So do you know what's happening for, like, within med schools or programs that are training therapists? Are they adding the spiritual piece to the sort of psychosocial bio model of addictions?
I mean, spirituality and addiction is a whole nother talk that I have, and I don't want to go on for 45 minutes. But indeed, in terms of addiction counseling, spirituality is used broadly because of the success of 12-step programs. That's actually been documented even by the Cochrane Project, and therefore there's some element allowed in there. On the other hand, the brain disease model is also very, very powerful as well. What's interesting is that in terms of Indigenous spirituality, in terms of this paper, that between those two models, and very often there's not a lot of dialogue between those two models, there is, I would say, an increasing tendency to adopt, to make room for the concept of spirituality in a way that may not happen for other populations. And I think it is it's basically as a result that it's a product of the fact that the other model just isn't working, that other models aren't working, and therefore people are more receptive to something outside of the box. But in terms of med school and training about spirituality, I'm not that.
Or just even addressing racism.
Right. Well, you know what? Again, I would say we were really on the cusp of doing something serious about that. I mean, there have been a number of reports. The big report that came out of British Columbia, for example, on racism in healthcare delivery, that was a very significant report. We cited in our chapter very frequently, to Lafon's report, and so people are taking notice of it. But still, all of this is, I would say, we're not there yet. We have begun, and I think that's an important note for the entire paper, that we're not in a post-secular society. In one chapter, Paul and I call it an interregnum between the secular and the post-secular. And a post-secular society is simply a society that takes religion seriously, that allows for a space for religion and spirituality in public life. And so the medical agencies tend to be, scientific and very secular, and hold spirituality at a distance, except in this kind of neatly compartmentalized section called chaplaincy and spiritual care, right? But now it's escaping from that compartment into some actual medical practices. So.
All right. Next is Donald.
Okay, I went to a book launch last night. The book's called White Benevolence, and it's primarily oriented to social work. But what we're talking about right now is, and one of the things they talked about is the predisposition of healthcare professionals to make assumptions about the condition of an Indigenous person without any investigation. I'm wondering if you encountered that during. Well, I think we're talking about the same thing here. I might not be putting it quite the right. Well, I'm going to throw this out there.
Okay. You know what? First of all, many of these initiatives are I suppose, in response to that very attitude. So, in other words, if you can, if you put healthcare actually in the hands of an Indigenous community, control over the agency, not simply to have a mainline business as usual agency, all of a sudden do a little bit of sensitivity training. Everyone takes a 3-hour sensitivity training module online, and then attempts to, and say they have addressed the problem. I mean, there are things like that. There are also serious attempts to end the kind of guard-wardian relationship where it's assumed that Indigenous people cannot competently handle healthcare as a public service. That part is being seriously questioned. So again, these are first steps, but we're not there yet. Let's face it.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Paul? You are on mute, or we cannot hear you, Paul.
Looks like it's your microphone, Paul.
Yeah. Okay. Now you can hear me?
Yeah, you go.
Okay. Just to speak a little bit to Don's question, and thanks, Dave. We were certainly not arguing that these programs, policies, and so forth solve everything. They are, however, not nothing. And so if you're looking for signs of sort of positive signs from major state entities, these are pretty positive signs, which is not to say that you can get perfect buy-in from all the people in the system, doctors, nurses, orderlies, and so forth. And I think you can look carefully at any of these sites and find all kinds of examples of imperfect implementation of these policies. But again, they're not nothing. And the other point that we make in the paper is that much of the conversation around post-secularism in North America, and I think in Europe, has to do with, can the state manage to integrate Muslim newcomers in a less dehumanizing or in a more humanistic manner, right? They're often the case study for whether we can have a better future form of secularism. And part of what David and I are trying to do is to say, look, that's an interesting conversation, the question of sort of Asian, South Asian, Arab immigration, and can we rethink our society in a way that is somewhat more inclusive of their whole selves, religious as well as personal, physical, political. But if you actually just look at what's happening vis-a-vis the relation between the state and the dominant social instruments, organs, and Indigenous people, you actually see some signs of creativity. In other words, I think we're not quite as creative as a society vis-a-vis Muslim integration or rethinking ways of thinking about the turban or kirpan and so forth. Whereas actually there's a greater sign of flexibility and openness to thinking about how to come to terms with the terrible things that the state and its various organs have done to get control over the land and other resources. So in other words, that might be just a place to look if we're thinking about new models. And in fact, the way the state and its organs have responded to Indigenous phenomena and people and totally legitimate complaints might actually teach us something about how we might better approach or differently approach or more creatively approach Muslim newcomers who have been asking for something like a post-secular or something like a rearrangement of secularism in whether it's European or Canadian contexts.
Yeah.
All right, thanks, Paul, for your comments. Thank you so much. Sorry to interrupt you, but we don't have too much time, so I'm going to leave it to Stacy for the last question, please.
That's great. Thanks, everyone. Thanks so much for the really interesting presentation. I'm glad you guys are doing this research. I think it'll be really helpful. While you were talking, I kind of had sort of a couple things come to mind. I'll try to keep it quick though, which are two important critiques of the sort of benevolence kind of model that you might find interesting, which is that, of course, Diane Million's Therapeutic Nations kind of talks about the focus on healing in the context particularly of neoliberal colonialism. And then more policy oriented is Stephanie Erlbacher Fox's Finding Dasha. And she uses the term actually dysfunction theodicy, kind of an interesting fun twist, to talk about how the state uses Indigenous people's supposed dysfunction as a rationale for their suffering and thinks about suffering as this analytic category. And I thought those would both be really interesting in conversation with your work. But then that led me to the kind of wondering if you do put the kind of context of capitalism or neoliberalism in relation to secularism within the paper. Because something like, Eunice Stoughton Camp, for example, which was established and functioned as a healing lodge, obviously, does not have this state support. Or I was just up at Heality, which is kind of thought of as a Kwakwaka'wakw sort of healing space as well. That's like unrecognized, and when they get in the way of industry is probably going to, suffer the same issues potentially. So I wonder if when you're looking at these examples of Indigenous spiritual, medical sort of programs and lodges and et cetera, if you are kind of like making a distinction or thinking about, I guess, authority within those and sources of funding and just kind of accounting for that.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
To be honest, Stacey, thank you, and please send me those or send us those references. That goes a little bit beyond the scope of this paper. I do talk about how earlier about the move from Christian Canada to the secular story. It's tied in with the evolution of the Canadian economy after World War II. I mean, a free market system requires that no relationship between the individual that the individual has should be, that all relationships that are not rational economic relationship are unfreedom. So ties to family, to neighborhood, to First Nation, to ethnicity, those are all get in the way of the rational actor, and therefore have to be undone. So a lot of the push or the dismantling of Christian Canada was in fact part of the dissolution of all relationships that individuals should have. So that happens between the 1945 and 1970, and then with the introduction of neoliberalism, it becomes even more the push to individualization. And we do talk about this individualism, commercialism, materialism. John Burroughs hammered us on the head to make sure that we mentioned this and made it more prominent in the chapter. That those trends, which are obviously tied to the evolution of the economy and the expansion of the free market system into all aspects of life, needed to be highlighted in the chapter. So thank you again for the reminder. Excellent reminder.
All right, so that was a great conversation. We could continue, but we still have Matt who's going to do his presentation. And Matt Sheedy is visiting professor of Canadian Studies in the North American Studies program at the University of Bonn in Germany, and a part-time lecturer in the Department of Religion at the University of Manitoba. His research focuses on method and theory in the study of religion, critical theories of religion and secularism, as well as representations of Muslims, Christians, atheists, and indigenous traditions in the modern public sphere. His latest book is Owning the Secular, Religious Symbols, Culture Wars, Western Fragility that came out by Routledge on 2021. And he is currently under a contract for a book entitled Islam According to Google News. Isn't that a very enticing title? How media shape the way we talk about religion. The title of his presentation for today is Between Neoliberalism and Decolonization on Some Key Challenges of the Digital Age. Matt, please.
Great, thank you very much. Can everyone hear me? All
Yes.
right, I'm just going to do a screen share now. And how is that visual? Is that good for everyone?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to be covering a lot of ground here, far too much ground for such a short talk, but hopefully I touch on some key points that are useful for discussion that we can carry on afterwards. So in The University in Ruins, Bill Reddings argues that the modern university has experienced three main ideas. And I'm quoting, the Kantian concept of reason, the Humboldtian idea of culture, and now the techno-bureaucratic notion of excellence, end quote. The crux of Reddings' argument is that for all its flaws, the Humboldtian model of education stressed comprehensive general learning and the development of cultural knowledge as an end in itself. Since the early 1990s, Reddings observes how a corporatized multinational ideology of excellence has emerged that follows market logics rather than national interests. This corporate-led techno-bureaucratic notion of excellence has only intensified since the 90s and remains one of the most dominant ideologies informing mainstream cultural, economic, and political life today. In this paper, I address the theme of crisis and transition in the study of religion through the broader lens of neoliberal ideology and decolonization, which I will outline in 3 steps. First, I lay out some broad themes concerning neoliberal ideology, followed by a discussion of Scott Elliott's 2013 volume, Reinventing Religious Studies, Key Writings in the History of a Discipline, covering 40 years of debates in the Council of Societies for the Study of Religion, bulletin from 1969 to 2009. One thing that is clear when looking back on this time period is that a feeling of crisis and transition has always been lingering in the field, though the terms and conditions have decidedly changed. Previous crises in the study of religion primarily focused on who gets to determine the shape and identity of the field, theology or some blend of humanism and naturalism. In our current era, the very existence of the field as a tenuous member of the humanities and social sciences is increasingly on its heels. And this time, the power to contest our disciplinary identity may be largely out of our hands. Or is it? This leads me to my final pillar of consideration, decolonization and its prospects as a tool to address our current moment. One through line linking the development of the study of religion with our current state of crisis is the emergence and eventual dominance of neoliberal ideology, which is commonly thought to have gained political power in the mid-1970s, accelerated under Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, and consolidated under Bill Clinton and Tony Blair. Well-known political economists like Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman helped to popularize neoliberal ideologies during this period, which meant discrediting Keynesian ideas on the importance of government spending, including support for the university as an essential pillar of social stability. The growth of critical commentary on neoliberalism jumped considerably from the early 1990s to 2010, with a wide range of political and scholarly analysis trying to make sense of what this term signifies as a description of contemporary political, economic, and ideological trends. While space does not allow for much of a discussion on neoliberalism, Wendy Brown's description of it as, and I quote, "A bundle of policies privatizing public ownership and services, radically reducing the social state, and leashing labor is a useful one as it points to particular structural changes that are commonly linked to this term." In addition to these structural changes, critiques of neoliberalism often frame it as a disciplinary ideology that naturalizes these trends in such a way that we come to see them as the way things are, as is argued, for example, in a new comprehensive study from May of 2022 in the Association for Psychological Science. Making this case in his 2021 book, The Age of Precarity, Dario Gentili argues that the type of subjectivity that neoliberalism tends to produce is reflected in the self-employed entrepreneur, where precarity has become a mode of life promoting survival within the market order above all else. This is just as true for those working in permanent jobs with benefits as it is for the and underemployed precariat, since the art of neoliberal governance incentivizes individual survival over solidarity and collective organizing. Sociologist Vivek Chibber makes a similar observation by arguing that it is more rational for most people to resist inequities on an individual basis as opposed to a collective one, in what he calls forms of passive consent to current conditions. According to Chibber, it is not that the majority are duped into thinking that the status quo is great, but that opting for some form of self-preservation is seen as a logical choice over the risk of speaking out as a powerless voice in the wilderness. Notwithstanding the persistence of older educational models and initiatives, the point that Brown, Gentili, Chibber, and others are making is that we lack sufficient tools to deal with our current crisis, while remaining indentured to older paradigms and ways of thinking. To the extent that this structural analysis is accurate, or at least partially accurate, it is worth considering what these trends can tell us about the type of crisis and transition that we face. Are we at fault for not innovating with the times? Or are we perhaps victims of larger social forces that we don't have the collective power to fight back against? What kinds of methods, theories, critiques, modes of organizing, and relationships do we need to focus on in order to better position ourselves to weather these growing storms? Scott Elliott's volume opens with a commissioned essay by Harold Remus, reflecting on the CSSR from 1969 to 2009, and its role in bringing together numerous professional societies interested in shaping the field as a discipline. As one example, Remus points to conversations among council members in 1973 on new and emerging areas, such as new religious movements, Native American, women's, and Afro-American studies. Claude Welch's 1970 piece echoes this call for unifying religious studies through the development of journals and graduate programs, while stressing the need for, and I quote, more adequate interpretation of the scholarly study of religion to government agencies, end quote. Well, it could be argued that the discipline has succeeded in developing the study of previously marginalized areas, such as gender, race, and non-normative traditions. The challenge of unifying the field remains unresolved. Debates over area studies, critical or big tent approaches continue unabated, as does the question of whether and or how to communicate with government agencies and the broader public. Another common theme in the annals of the CSSR Bulletin is the problem with religious studies relying too heavily on imports from other fields, such as Victor Turner, Mary Douglas, and Clifford Geertz. While Ninian Smart acknowledges that Mircea Eliade has made waves outside religious studies proper in an essay from 1979, he sees a need to move beyond Eliade's influence and export theories that we are particularly adept to lead in, such as comparative ethics, the history of religions, and addressing the insider-outsider problem. Smart ends his piece by reflecting on the state of universities in 1979, noting that they are not increasing in size, that, and I quote, religious studies is not laser technology and doesn't acquire funding easily, while concluding with a warning that we're shrinking almost if we don't watch out. And the only way in which we may develop research in new directions is from sources outside our institutions, end quote. These early contributions in the CSSR Bulletin presage future debates that are still with us today, including objectivity versus experience and special pleading, straddling the boundaries between humanistic and social scientific research, the insider-outsider problem, as well as striking a balance between studying older versus modern traditions and contemporary concerns. While the question of what defines the field of religious studies has not disappeared, advances have been made when it comes to the development of critical methods and areas of study, such as the post-9/11 rise in studies in secularism and non-religion, as we saw in our previous panel. At this point, at least two things are clear from these early contributions. First, defining the field as distinct from theology has been a perennial concern since the 1960s, as has the tension between certain varieties of humanism, so for example, centering experience and existential concerns, and more rigorous social scientific approaches, such as cognitive science of religion. Needless to say, as austerity continues to spread, careful consideration of how the public perceives what we do and how we do it is more important than ever. Second, there appears to have been a shift in how we view the problem of unifying the field. Whereas earlier debates focused on which methods and theories will help us to clearly define ourselves as a discipline in order to secure a stable academic future, current discussions of crises don't seem to have a lot to offer beyond talk of greater diversity within the academy, reactions to Trumpism, modest nods to adjunct and contingent labor, and expressing concerns over the climate emergency. Perhaps the recent and unprecedented wave of union organizing in the US and places like Amazon and Starbucks, including adjunct professors in California, might offer us a shot in the arm moving forward. In a roundtable discussion from 1996 featuring Darlene Yushka, Rosa McCutcheon, Brian E. Malley, and Gustavo Benafides, we find the most pointed and contemporaneous critique of neoliberalism in Eliot's volume, with themes including critical scholarship versus caretaking, identity politics, and the role of social movements outside the university informing what we do. For Yushka, the relative success of identity politics in dismantling grand narratives has been tempered by populist trends throughout the 1990s, where the centering of the particular interests of distinct groups, for example, women, racialized, and queer communities, has overtaken efforts to unify the field through shared methods and theories. I take this to be a prescient observation on Yushka's part. Although there are still many challenges when it comes to theorizing gender, racialized, and queer communities, the adoption of theoretical frameworks to address these issues has not been lacking in recent decades. Importantly, Yushka also urges scholars to connect, and I quote, economic and political activity off campus with those on campus in order to better understand the difficulties we presently face, end quote. On this front, it would appear that critical approaches like political economy and class analysis have not followed suit, aging out with those baby boomer Marxists. While space does not allow me to elaborate on other aspects of debates in the field from 1969 to 2009, it is worth dwelling for a moment on the period after 2013, when Eliot's volume was published. Here I'm thinking of how the surge of identity politics to the advent of social media has created new modes of myth-making, especially when it comes to questions of race, gender, and sexual identities. While these are often volatile, hot-button topics, much of the discourse on these questions resembles debates in the study of religion between critical and apologetic approaches. While it is true that a certain sector of scholarship has leaned into identity-related questions when theorizing, it strikes me that there is room to push this work further and perhaps even export some of our expertise when it comes to walking the tightrope between insiders and outsiders, priests and heathens, as Ninian Smart, albeit with a different set of concerns, called for over 40 years ago. Given the lack of jobs in religious studies, humanities, and much of the social sciences, we would do well to make better use of younger scholars on these pressing social issues, whose proximity to new trends, slang, subcultures, and digital technologies gives them a tremendous advantage over many older scholars, myself included, who naturally lose the thread of connectivity to the rhythms and life worlds of those who swim in these waters each and every day. Indigenous decolonization in settler colonial states like Canada builds upon work in post-colonial studies towards questions of political, economic, and cultural sovereignty, including the reclaiming of Indigenous epistemologies. Following this three-pronged model of political, economic, and cultural sovereignty, Sarah Mackenzie describes decolonization in Canada as the, and I quote, dismantling of colonial hierarchies, the rebalancing of unequal power relations between Indigenous peoples and white settlers, and the eventual forging of alternative modes of relations, end quote, including how we relate to land and resources. We have seen some cultural and political changes following the monumental I Don't Know More movement in 2012, and the agreement to implement the findings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission with its 94 calls to action. On the grassroots level, this can be seen with calls to decolonize education, the university, including changing colonial names, as well as areas of study such as literature, math, law, and so forth. For Maori scholar Linda Tuhiwa Smith, decolonizing methodologies, which is a term that she coined, focuses on the process of insiders, quote, coming to know and understand theory and research from our own perspectives and for our own purposes, end quote. This indigenous-centered approach focuses on revitalizing indigenous practices and forms of knowledge as an essential pillar of decolonizing Western epistemologies, or what Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang refer to as internal colonialism. At the same time, such practices also challenge settler scholars and citizens alike to rethink their own forms of knowledge. As Kim Tallbear writes on the role of indigenous bioscientists, the goal is not just, quote, browning the laboratory, but to show how indigenous epistemologies advance knowledge by working with different paradigms and by asking different sets of questions. Unlike Western geneticists, for example, Tallbear notes how Native American scholars working on DNA are interested in, quote, how tribal peoples today are related to one another, and not just in the past, and how human genetics and plant genetics illuminate those relationships, end quote. To the extent that indigenous epistemologies like these are slowly being implemented, we might say that decolonizing methodologies are gaining some traction, at least more so than in the past. At the same time, as Tuck and Yang argue, decolonization is, quote, far too often subsumed into the directives of civil human rights-based social justice projects, which turns decolonization into a metaphor that, and I quote, recenters whiteness, resettles theory, extends innocence to the settler, and entertains a settler future, end quote. For these authors, writing in 2012, talk of decolonization does not grapple with the centrality of land and its repatriation to indigenous peoples. While I have issues with some of the more radical statements of Tuck and Yang, who at one point suggest that true decolonization would mean that, quote, all settlers become landless, end quote, one implication of this argument finds parallels with the challenges of grappling with the effects of neoliberalism on tenured scholars, adjunct laborers, and students alike, albeit in different ways. While many scholars and administrators have been willing to grapple with questions surrounding identity politics on the level of representation, larger structural issues that are fundamental to our survival as a discipline, such as the overcoming of adjunct labor, are still in a nascent, albeit growing stage of development. Although the analogy between centering land and indigenous struggles for decolonization with centering neoliberalism in relation to the academy is no doubt uneven, the parallel, I believe, remains. Namely, whether we have merely assimilated critiques of neoliberalism and decolonization into our existing frameworks versus taking seriously the long-term implications of ignoring the underlying structural conditions that threaten the very existence of these communities as such. In closing, I'd like to pose a series of critical questions that I hope will provoke further discussion. To what extent have neoliberal administrative aims defanged more radical approaches toward grappling with this concept and its effects in favor of increased representation without also attending to deeper structural changes? To the extent that Indigenous and minoritized scholars have made inroads, how have we acted in concert with them and to what ends? Do our collaborations address the problem of cutbacks and austerity measures? While it is essential to be in solidarity with Indigenous and minoritized communities, it may be of little value if our power continues to diminish in the face of austerity. Relatedly, how have we advocated and mobilized in our collective interests during the Trudeau era, where we have a government that is, in theory, more amenable to funding higher education than the alternative? Should the political should the political winds change once again toward a Harper-style politics, we may find ourselves in a deeper hole than we are already in. Ideas such as consent and consultation, along with nation-to-nation relationships, are far more common than the more radical versions of decolonization, though they too can easily be watered down and assimilated into neoliberal and settler colonial ideologies. Taken seriously, however, the implications of consultation and nation-to-nation relationships reflect cooperative models of decision-making and power sharing that have the virtue, or at least the potential virtue, of accounting for a diversity of positions, of showing a willingness to modify one's own epistemological worldviews, and hold the possibility of creating different social structures and relationships than those that constrain the present. If these ideas and ideals have any merit, then perhaps we might also consider how such models of relationality might benefit the highly unequal and stratified academy between government and corporations, university administrators and departments, tenured faculty and adjunct labor, and the place of students within these complex webs of association. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt. That certainly is provocative in multiple ways, and I am sure that that's what you intended, so really good. So let's open it up for any questions that any one of you might have. If you could please use the raise hand feature so that I can know who you are and then call you, that would be great. There is certainly a whole lot here. Decolonization is not a metaphor for sure. So anyone who would like to ask the first question? Here you go, David, please.
Thank you, Matt, for a remarkable paper. I really enjoyed it. Yeah, it seems to me that I mean, Nestor just referred to it. Decolonization is not a metaphor. In fact, so far, I think it largely has been used in a metaphoric sense. It seems to me it's one of those words. I think like a post-secular society or a post-patriarchal society in which we don't really know what would it look like. You know, I mean, if we move away from, you know, a post-neoliberal society, for example, what would, in your mind anyway, what would be the direction that a post-neoliberal university and hence a post-neoliberal academic study of religion look like?
Oh, that's a big question. I'm not sure I was quite ready for that one. I mean, I think on the one hand, it seems evident that there is a revitalization in recent years amongst contingent and adjunct scholars towards talking about making visible their precarious status and being forthright with what some of the broader implications of that are. There's certainly a lot of tenured scholars who are sympathetic to that, who show a variety of signs of solidarity, but I think that we certainly lack the collective organization, the institutional structures, even the spaces within our universities, which are often divided and segregated across campus, to meet regularly, to put our heads together and to create different models that can help us think through some of these problems. I don't have any grand solutions when it comes to anything beyond speaking more to one another, organizing, widening the circle, and certainly when thinking about decolonization, I see forms of potential relationality and solidarity between Indigenous-centered concerns and issues and those of growing numbers of people who are precarious and very much feeling, albeit in very different ways, the sting of a certain type of economic marginalization at the very least. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but that's the best I could come up with on the spot.
Well, I was doubly interested both as a scholar of religion, but also as president of our faculty association that's currently renegotiating the collective agreement for our contract academic staff. So I'm listening to you with both hats on.
All right, thank you, David. All right, folks. Anyone else would like to ask a question to Matt? I mean, there's really a whole lot there. And while we're waiting for people, if it's okay, I'd be interested, Matt, how do you negotiate this tension that is oftentimes when people are talking about decolonization, oftentimes goes to the indigenous communities and focus heavily on the indigenous communities. And I'm not sure that is even possible now in the context of Canada, given the wide range of of people from different places in the world, the phenomenal ethno-racial diversity that we're dealing with. So how do you negotiate those tensions between wanting to speak to the indigenous questions and concerns, and at the same time keeping in mind that those don't incorporate or don't include, certainly not by a long shot, the concerns of racialized communities?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question, a really big question. The first thing that popped into my head is a course I'm designing for next semester, which is tentatively titled something like Critical Race Theory, Rhetoric versus Realities. And one thing I'm really interested in developing in this course and thinking about more broadly in my research, certainly in relation to questions of decolonization, is how once concepts become mainstreamed, like critical race theory or Islamophobia, for example, they often take on a life of their own and they become subject to tremendous distortion and manipulation that moves far away from the concerns of the communities that raise them first and foremost, and also the scholarly world that has developed these ideas over time, often in very sort of thoughtful, slow, and deliberate ways. And I think that developing more theories and more awareness of that tension and how easy it is to get sucked into the rhetorical uses of things like critical race theory or decolonization, which often compels us to respond to very problematic, very oftentimes exaggerated, distorted, absurd notions of what these things actually are, serves as a tremendous distraction from the actual work that is taking place, both in the scholarly realm and amongst grassroots communities. And so for me, one way of trying to think about that, at least from my own particular perspective, is to really foreground those tensions. And ideally from there, think of ways to cut through a lot of that rhetorical distortion that gets used as a wedge issue in the culture wars. Don't know if that answered your question, but that's just...
There's a lot more, but I think there's a whole lot more to have a conversation, but I think Sabine wanted to ask a question. So Sabine, would you please?
Yeah, sure. Hi. Thank you so much for your presentation. There's a lot of points that I think overlap with some of the work that I'm looking at. A network of Sikh influencers and their activism and how they negotiate those things as they do this work. And I've had really frank conversations with them about, how do they understand this like trap of neoliberalism and like how are they like self-reflective of that, especially being involved in these like progressive social movements that are quickly becoming part of their brand. So there's like that element that I think the commodification of some of these like movements in some ways, which I think is really, I get a sense that people are actually scared to talk about, but there's a growing discussion around like wokeism and how to actually talk about it and differentiate it between something that's like more substantive and more deep, and getting past this like tip of the iceberg experience of engaging in the work of decolonization, for example. So that's like one side that I'm like super, and I'd love to talk to you more about it. But I guess on the other side of just how it impacts our field, and as a graduate student, I think about this too, and our responsibility we have to, when we enter departments or as I'm studying, like how is the way I'm studying either supporting this or challenging it in some ways? And then how do we resist? And maybe this is for a conversation for some of the graduate students in the room too, that we can talk about later, but like, how do we resist turning ourselves into those brands and falling, and what are faculties and religious studies departments doing to protect us from this, reproducing this? And so you're your presentation is really just inspired. So I don't think I have a question, but I just appreciate that you've given us an entry point to talk about this in a particular way, especially with religious studies in mind.
Well, thank you for saying that. And if I could pick up briefly on one of the themes you mentioned there, one of the things I commented on was, I think the importance of really mobilizing younger scholars, and I mean scholars younger than myself, who are immersed in these digital worlds that are, increasingly and at an exponential rate coming to inform how media, how communication, how political organization actually works and takes place. And it's dizzying. It's very hard to keep up with. But there are, as I'm sure you and others might know, for example, sites like Prager University, Turning Points USA, people surrounding Jordan Peterson or others who, quite literally actively target woke professors, call them out, dox them on social media. I mean, there are McCarthy-esque threats that are out there. And thinking about, how we can engage with these sorts of issues without commodifying them or becoming a brand, as you say, I think, as a start, certainly does require more literacy, more engagement with these new complicated terrains that are changing all the time, and that really do leave us spinning on our heels. And so, yeah, I mean, I learn a lot from those scholars younger than me who are engaging in platforms I'm not aware of, but it's a challenge for sure to keep up with. So yeah, thank you for that.
All right, so I think we've run out of time. So, and I certainly do not want to keep everybody here. Please join me to thank both our presenters, Matt and David. Thank you very much. Really, there is a whole lot to talk about, but we'll have other chances. Thank you very much. And I think this is it for the day. So I think Sarah has already left the information on the chat.
I have. So yeah, thank you to Nestor for moderating today and to our two presenters. Great panel. And yes, this is the last session for the day, the last day of the conference. So thanks to everyone who took part. Just one quick promo. We've got the annual general meeting happening for the CSSR in a couple of weeks. So on June 15th at 1 p.m. Eastern. And we'll be sending around the Zoom details to the current CSSR members. So please do join us for that, to have your say in the society and to continue all of these great discussions. So thanks so much, everyone. You have a great summer, if I don't see you before, and look forward to seeing you at more of the society's activities.